Welcome to Dili.
In this video, we're going to show you the best of Dili. Whenever we read online or whoever we met told us the first thing to do in this city is go visit the Resistance Museum.
After all, Dili has one of the most interesting pieces of history written all about it, and all of that is something that we want to share with you.
After that, we're going to visit some of these historical sites and take you guys along. We will end this video by watching a beautiful sunset from the most impressive spot here in Dili.
So our first stop for the day is this building behind us. This is the Museum of Resistance here in Dili, the capital of Timor Leste. And here we came to learn about the incredibly painful history of this country, and I just wanted to share this with you. The story of Timor Leste begins many centuries ago. In fact, this entire region was inhabited for a long time by humans, about the same time as the Aborigines were living in Australia, and parts of Asia were inhabited by other civilizations. So in the 1500s, the Portuguese who were ruling India at that time had deputed a ship under the guidance of Governor Albuquerque to come here to discover the new lands. India at that time was the new diamond in the jewelry box for a lot of the Western colonial powers, and newer lands were being discovered as they began to take better control of that part of Asia. The eastern parts of Asia, which comprised of Indonesia, Papua New Guinea and Australia, were all of the new attractive pieces of land that were drawing the colonial power. Indonesia at that time was also being taken over by many of these colonial powers, one after the other, with the Dutch holding down their fort for the longest amount of time. At that time, the Portuguese, who were looking for, basically greener grass on the other side, landed in Timor, and they occupied a portion of this island, basically in the same way they did with the Brazilians. The Portuguese came here bearing the idea of trading, and then they interacted with the local kingdoms. And here there were about 60 different kingdoms, all of them proclaiming their allegiance to basically two sets of rulers, one part of the Eastern Timor land and one part of the Western Timor land. And obviously there were cultural differences that were existing between these two sets of groups. The Portuguese found it much easier to control the eastern parts, whereas the Dutch found it much easier to control the western land. So the biggest monetary attraction for the colonial powers was the potential this land had with sandalwood and coffee. This gave them ample opportunity to export a lot of these products back into the Western world and sell it at high prices. In India also, coffee and sandalwood were very popular exports for the British Empire at the same time, and Portuguese found this to be a competing business. For almost 400 years, the Portuguese ruled, gradually extending their control more and more, and in the 1900s, the Portuguese had complete control over the eastern part of the island. The western part, still in Dutch control, began to unravel in a different way, which I will tell you in a little bit. In 1939, as World War II began, a lot of instability began to show itself in this region. The Portuguese were a failing nation or an empire by itself, with many of their lands scattered all over Africa and this part of Asia. And at the same time, the Dutch were losing their control as well. But during World War II, the Japanese came here and took control of Dili. Locals were basically afraid of Japanese dictatorship because it was known to be a very violent thing. Therefore, they supported the Portuguese to send off the Japanese and take back control of this land. On the other hand, in 1945, as World War II ended, Netherlands gave up Indonesia, and Indonesia became an independent nation, and at that time it was subject to a military dictatorship. About the same time, multiple resistance parties began to take shape in more of a quiet form. It wasn't really out there, but these groups of people were predominantly East Timorese people who wanted to fight for an independent country of their own. The Portuguese continued to rule until 1974, but in 1974, a coup that happened in Lisbon resulted in a complete destabilization of the Portuguese Empire. Here in this part of the Eastern Timor, there were two political parties, UDT and Freitlin, which basically gathered support from the local people to talk about an independent country. But in 1974, just after the coup in Portugal, UDT claimed unilaterally an independent Eastern Timor and they proclaimed that they were the rulers of the land. A couple of days later, the Freitlin group announced that they had more control of this part of land, and they decided to proclaim unilateral independence of this country under their own leadership. With that, the Portuguese government let go, and the independent governments of Timor Leste were being formed by Freitlin. Indonesia at the same time was very apprehensive because during the Cold War, there was a very big mess that had begun in Asia, capitalism versus communism, and as you know, there was a very big problem that had begun in Vietnam with in Indochina, basically the Vietnam War that was happening between the US forces and the guerrilla forces of North Vietnam. And there was a lot of fear that Timor-Leste could also fall into the clutches of communism because of the Chinese influence in the area. However, the president of Indonesia, and Indonesia at the time was not in support of communism but rather in support of capitalism. The Indonesian president visited America to get the support of the then President Gerald Ford and also of the Secretary of State Kissinger. And with that, and a lot of weaponry that Indonesia housed, a lot of America-made weapons that Indonesia used. And they say the Americans opposed it, but Indonesia came and began a military invasion of Timor-Leste in 1974. And on 5th December 1975, a full-scale military invasion by the Indonesian government brought Timor-Leste to its knees. Even till then, Timor-Leste was barely a self-proclaimed independent nation, still under the effective control of the Portuguese. But on this day, the Portuguese government had completely lost control. Even the local resistance was losing, and they ran into the mountains to hide to survive the onslaught of the Indonesian forces. From 1975 until 1978, there was massive massacre. There was a lot of painful treatment and torture exerted on the locals, on the Timorese people by the Indonesian military, with nearly 1/3 of the entire population of the country being wiped out. So from about 650,000 people that existed in 1974, it was only about 450,000 people that remained as of 1978. This became such a sad state that everybody could have potentially made a big furore about it, but at the same time, the Indonesian government, the military rather, was able to control all the information that was going out to the outside world. Even journalists from Australia who were here documenting this entire process were massacred, and nobody knew about it till much later. Between 1975 and many years to come, the resistance from the local Timorese people began to grow more and more. It's only in the 1990s when there was one incident called the Massacre of the Santa Cruz Cemetery that really took off with the pro-resistance movement and the fight for independence. At about the same time, there were two things happening simultaneously. One was the resistance was trying to make diplomatic inroads with both Indonesia and the United Nations, seeking the help of the Portuguese. And at the same time, the resistance continued a violent guerrilla warfare tactic to get their own lands under their own control. Again, massive onslaught and massacre of the local innocent civilians happened. Finally, in the late 1990s, with the interference of the United Nations, a vote was put into effect where the Timorese people were asked to choose whether Indonesia should continue to rule them, preferably with an autonomy, or they did not believe in being a part of Indonesia. And for the last 20 years, this had been a constantly fighting province, the 27th province of the Indonesian nation as it existed then. However, with the votes being in favor of not being part of the Indonesian autonomic enclave or province, the United Nations and Indonesia agreed that this would become, therefore, an independent territory. And whatever was done to make this a part of Indonesia was undone by the form of signing many of these international agreements, and peacekeeping forces arrived in the country in order to help them become independent. And on 20th May 2002, this country became independent and proclaimed itself as Timor-Leste with the guidance of the United Nations, and its first democratically elected government was formed in this part of the world. So it's interesting to note how this country is the youngest country in Southeast Asia and also therefore one of the poorest because of all that has happened here. And the people still have memories and wounds from these 40 years of fighting and painful torture that existed. Many families continue to remain in that thought that something could go wrong even today. But for the last 20 years, things have been turning around well for this country. Even today, it happens to be one of the poorest countries in Southeast Asia, with many people living under $1 a day. $1.29 a day, which is, it sounds absurd, right? That's like about 100 rupees, and still they try to find their happiness in all of this. So that was the story we learnt about Timor Leste, and now we'll go on to explore more of the city.
Welcome to 1, 2, 3, 4. Welcome
Namaskaram.
to